There's a lot of talk these days about the Federal Reserve Bank, referred to as the Fed for short. There are many reserve banks in the world, including the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Central Bank for central banks, the Bank of International Settlements, but still, the Federal Reserve is the most influential, in large part because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, at least for now. The financial markets hang on the Fed governor's every word, knowing that their fortunes will rise or fall accordingly. But worse, the Fed determines the future development of the nation. And now that the Fed's decade-long massive money printing scheme to save the financial system has finally ignited inflation on the retail level, the Fed is tasked with taming the inflation it created, but it's expected to do so without causing an implosion of the enormous financial bubble its easy money policy has inflated. But alas, it is impossible to save both the predatory parasite and its host. Only one can survive. The situation has now come about that by merely raising interest rates to previously normal levels, the entire debt-bloated money system will crash. It is inevitable and no doubt intended. The Federal Reserve Bank literally controls the fate of nations, the wealthiest nation especially. There's an old saying that money makes the world go round. And as every Christian knows, Satan is the god of this world. So it stands to reason that the devil has crafted a dishonest system in order to manipulate money as a mechanism to control the world. I realize that most people are not very interested in history. However, the ongoing war between the prophetic kings of the North and South involves the present and the immediate future in a most profound way. And when the time of the end begins, leading to the violent conclusion of the invisible war, the last book in the Bible reveals that no one will be able to buy or sell unless they worship the image of the beast being the political system in whatever form it will take then. Well, it remains to be seen how that coercion will come about. It is coming. Already we are being conditioned to submit to more and more tyranny and are under intense psychological warfare from an enemy very few people are even aware exists. In part 2, we left off with the king of the North plotting out schemes against the rival king of the South. What form have these schemes taken? What follows is expanded from the 2016 edition of Jehovah Has Become King. After the Civil War, the United States quickly emerged as the greatest industrial power on earth. It soon became clear to the aristocracy in London and Europe that the formal British Empire had reached its zenith under Queen Victoria and was surely doomed to fade into irrelevancy during the 20th century, unless something was done. In his book, The Anglo-American Establishment, historian Carroll Quigley wrote in considerable detail describing how numerous overlapping secret societies and round-table discussion groups were formed in Britain during the decades immediately preceding World War I, primarily devoted to the purpose of subverting the United States back under the control of the British Empire. One such group was the Fabian Society, which was established in the late 1800s with the long-range goal of conditioning the world to accept socialism. Appropriately, they adopted a wolf in sheepskin and a plodding tortoise as their logo. The Royal Institute for International Affairs was established in London in 1919, also known as Chatham House, with its sister organization in the USA called the Council on Foreign Relations, for the purpose of promoting Anglo-American relations and injecting British imperialism into the American political system. Virtually every president has to be vetted by the Council, and those who are not approved by London are considered enemies of the deep state. To this day, the CFR and their publication known as Foreign Affairs is one of the most influential voices in American politics. And of course, it is always the foremost advocate of war. Prior to World War I, the conspiring imperialists discussed how best to go about capturing the policy-making apparatus in the United States so that it might serve as their dumb giant, with the lords of London being the brains and America providing the brawn. As far as conspiracies go, it is the scheme of all schemes, intending to destroy the American system of economy throughout the planet and establish a new Anglo-world empire, a new world order, or as it's commonly referred to today, as the Great Reset. In order to establish their open conspiracy, as one of the foremost apologists for the empire called it, the conspirators recognized that first they had to throttle the American engine of production by controlling credit, which meant destroying the national banking and credit system within the United States. Speaking about this ongoing open conspiracy, this is an excerpt from an interview with Nancy Spanis, an editor with the Executive Intelligence Review, from about 1998.
Nancy, you've been studying the British New Dark Ages faction of the 19th and 20th century. Is there a plan behind all these wars and warfare?
It's quite eerie, Tony, when you go back and you look at the grouping that were the publicists for the British imperialists at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And you look particularly at people like in the Fabian Society, people in the Coefficients Club like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, Lord Bertrand Russell. And you see that they had a plan for reorganizing the world that would permit permanent control by their class, by Bertrand Russell's class. Wells was a commoner, but that would allow them to control through mind control, through drugs, through culture, the entire power over the universe. And they wrote about it quite openly. They said there was a faction around Ruskin in the late 19th century that openly said we want to go back to a new dark age. But these characters ostensibly wanted human progress, and they talked about human progress, but they actually wrote, and more than wrote, propagandized and manipulated a whole layer of culture and popular entertainment and drugs and all sorts of other artifacts which have shaped our culture today to create a kind of situation that we're facing now at the end of the 20th century.
although he doesn't recognize the British hand behind it. Edward Griffin documents in great detail in his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, how in 1913, through their American agents such as Paul Warburg, J.P. Morgan, and others, the old money banking cartel succeeded in foisting the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank upon the United States. This resulted in delivering the economic sovereignty of America into the hands of an exclusive clique of private bankers whose own aims were diametrically opposed to that of the people of the United States. Such an act was blatantly unconstitutional and is exactly what the American founders tried to prevent. But the scheme was so successful that to this day, most Americans assume that the Federal Reserve is a government institution. It is not. While the Federal Reserve is governed by a board of federally appointed governors, Edward Griffin points out in his book how that is merely window dressing to give the appearance that the Federal Reserve is a government institution. Jehovah's matchless foresight certainly seems to have described the ongoing conspiracy when centuries ago he inspired the prophet to write, "And they will plot schemes against him." The second aspect of the schemes of the empire of the financiers involved fomenting war on the continent of Europe. The original inventors of the United States of America realized the importance of keeping free from foreign entanglements and wars. To that end, in 1823, President James Monroe articulated the foreign policy of the United States in what has become known as the Monroe Doctrine. Essentially, the doctrine states that the United States will not become involved in foreign affairs of Europe and that the European colonial powers should not meddle in the affairs of the Americas. In the run-up to the First World War, the United States continued to maintain its neutrality toward the European powers. Even as war erupted in Europe, due mainly to the many entangled alliances of the European nations, the United States continued to remain neutral. For example, on August 19, 1914, President Woodrow Wilson addressed the U.S. Congress saying, "Every man who really loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality, which is the spirit of impartiality and fairness and friendliness to all concerned." However, the sinking of the British flag Lusitania by German U-boats, which resulted in the deaths of some 120 Americans, eventually drew the United States into the First World War in 1917 on the side of the British and French. To this day, though, the controversy continues as to whether the British baited the Germans into torpedoing the Lusitania by letting it be known that the passenger vessel was secretly shipping munitions from New York to Great Britain. The Lusitania supposedly even slowed down to linger in U-boat-infested waters off the coast of Ireland. Whether that particular Lusitanian conspiracy theory is true does not matter. What is historically significant is the fact that the anti-German propaganda eventually swayed American opinion in favor of the British. Woodrow Wilson's closest confidant and advisor, Colonel Edwin Mandell House, often referred to as Wilson's alter ego, was an Anglophile, if not an outright British agent, and one who was most responsible for steering the United States into the First World War. House was also apparently influential in the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank as well as being instrumental in the creation of the Council on Foreign Relations. As Woodrow Wilson's chief advisor, House is credited as the American architect of the failed League of Nations as well. Even though the entry of the United States into the Great War quickly tipped the balance of power in favor of the so-called Allies, America served as London's dumb giant, and afterward found itself saddled with a foreign-owned central bank and national policies increasingly under the influence of British imperialists. After a century of struggle against the geopolitical machinations of London, the events of the First World War successfully manipulated America into becoming the closest ally of its former colonial master. And London's imperial interests were served by having their continental imperial rivals crushed. So, in this way, the American King of the South was lured into a ruinous course by traitors loyal to the crown, so that the scripture was fulfilled that foretold, and the very ones eating his delicacies will bring his breakdown. On June 28, 1919, the victorious Allies sat together at the peace table and forced Germany to accept the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The signatories of the treaty pretended they were intent on peace. That was a lie. Historians are in agreement that the victors' terms of the treaty were so egregious and punitive, particularly as regards the vengefully exorbitant war reparations imposed upon Germany, that in reality the Peace Treaty of Versailles made the rise of Nazism and the Second World War virtually inevitable. In this way, Daniel 11:27 was fulfilled. And as regards these two kings, their heart will be inclined to doing what is bad. And at one table, a lie is what they will keep speaking. But nothing will succeed, because the end is yet for the appointed time. While the empire was successful in capturing their dumb giant, they were not immediately successful in creating an Anglo-controlled superstate, which is what some intended the League of Nations to eventually become. In spite of being hailed as the political expression of God's kingdom on earth by certain clergymen of the day, the United States Senate refused to even ratify the treaty, citing doing so as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Prophetic destiny would not permit the King of the North to achieve his coveted goal of uncontested world government until the appointed time of the end. In the meanwhile, 11 years after the end of the Great War, the King of the North used his newfound power over the financial affairs of the King of the South to further bring his breakdown by pulling the plug on the American economy. In his collection of essays entitled Against Oligarchy, historian Webster Tarpley documented how London intentionally created the Great Depression. Here are a few excerpts. The events leading to the Great Depression are all related to British economic warfare against the rest of the world, which mainly took the form of an attempt to restore a London-centered world monetary system incorporating the gold standard. The efforts of the British oligarchy in this regard were carried out by a clique of international central bankers dominated by Lord Montagu Norman of the Bank of England, assisted by his tool Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. The New York Stock Exchange speculation of the Coolidge-Hoover era was not a spontaneous phenomenon, but was rather deliberately encouraged by Norman and Strong under the pretext of relieving pressure on the overvalued British pound sterling after its gold convertibility had been restored in 1925. In practice, the pro-speculation policies of the U.S. Federal Reserve were promoted by Montague Norman and his satellites for the express purpose of fomenting a bubble economy in the United States. When this Wall Street bubble had reached gargantuan proportions in the autumn of 1929, Montague Norman sharply cut the British bank rate, repatriating British hot money and pulling the rug out from under the Wall Street speculators, thus deliberately and consciously imploding the U.S. markets. This caused a violent depression in the United States and some other countries, with the collapse of financial markets and the contraction of production and employment. In 1929, Norman engineered a collapse by puncturing the bubble. This depression was rendered far more severe and, more importantly, permanent by the British default on gold payment in September 1931. If Roosevelt had not broken decisively with Hoover's impotent refusal to fight the Depression, constitutional government might have collapsed. As it was, FDR was able to roll back the disintegration, but economic depression and mass unemployment were not overcome until 1940 and the passage of Lend-Lease.
If the average citizen is guaranteed equal opportunity in the polling place, he must have equal opportunity in the marketplace. These economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power. Our allegiance and our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power.
Because Franklin Roosevelt used his presidential powers to act against those whom he called economic royalists, obviously referring to the City of London bankers and their American lackeys back during the Great Depression, a plot was hatched from within the financier oligarchy to overthrow the government of the United States. It was foiled when a high-ranking military officer, Smedley Butler, exposed the conspiracy before Congress. But not only were the scheming imperialists determined to eradicate the American system of economy, it has also been their intention to control, corrupt, and ultimately destroy Christianity too. Because, in their view, the Republican system found its legitimacy in the foundational principle that man is in the image of God and that our rights are from God. And towards the close of the 19th century, it surely did not escape the notice of the demonic principalities, the real rulers of the world, that a small circle of anointed Christians began to form around Charles Taze Russell and the Watchtower. As in the first century, the King of the North will have to deal with his satanic master's earthly enemies. Hence we read at Daniel 11:28, and he will go back to his land with a great amount of goods, and his heart will be against the Holy Covenant, and he will act effectively and go back to his land